It has been a form of extreme punishment that countries use when all else fails. Some have even called them worse than war itself, since you can't see the enemy and have a chance to kill it. It's called sanctions, which a group of UN rights experts have called on countries to lift or ease sanctions to allow relief, especially when it comes to dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. In this debate, we will look at the country that has sanctioned other countries the most, namely the U.S., and look at which countries are suffering under this cruel method, which Iran has called economic terrorism.
As the United States is pushing ahead with its sanctions against several countries, these nations are struggling to contain the spread of the new coronavirus. This has led a group of UN experts to issue a statement calling for the removal of unilateral sanctions against these countries. The group said sanctions are bringing suffering and death to people in countries including Iran, Sudan, Syria, Yemen, Venezuela, and Cuba. It added that humanitarian exemptions are not working with people failing to receive life-saving treatments and protection against COVID-19.
Sanctions that were imposed in the name of delivering human rights are in fact killing people and depriving them of fundamental rights, including the rights to health, to food, and to life itself.
The UN panel reiterated that sanctions should be lifted or eased so that people can get basic hygienic items and hospitals can get the necessary equipment to save lives. UN Special Rapporteur Elena Douhan said licenses for delivery of humanitarian aid should be provided in the easiest way. She also noted that countries and organizations involved in the humanitarian aid should not be subjected to secondary sanctions. The International Red Cross and Red Crescent societies made a similar appeal at the start of the pandemic, but the calls have fallen on deaf ears. Analysts believe that economic warfare is currently the most powerful weapon being used by the West against the targeted countries.
To maintain West's mastery of the international scene and to weaken countries which are independent of the West and which pursue independent foreign policies, Western countries, principally America, have a number of weapons in their huge arsenal to employ. And one of the most powerful, one of the deadliest of weapons which the West uses to achieve the aforementioned objectives are sanctions. And if we look at countries around the world, such as Cuba, Venezuela, Syria, and Iran, the American sanctions on these countries have amounted to not just war crimes, but crimes against humanity.
The US is pursuing its maximum pressure policy against countries such as Iran and Venezuela at a time when many believe that Washington has failed with such a strategy to achieve its goal. The surprise resignation of US State Department Special Envoy for Iran, Brian Hook, might be a proof for the failure. He played an instrumental role in Washington's so-called maximum pressure campaign against Iran after President Donald Trump pulled out of the 2015 nuclear deal between Iran and world powers. Hook and the Trump administration have faced criticism at home and abroad for overly harsh and indiscriminate sanctions, which they said were hurting ordinary Iranians. The question now remains is how far the US administration intends to go with its economic pressure campaign, despite its failure to bring Iran, Venezuela, and North Korea to their knees through such tactic.
Our guest joining us for this edition of the debate, author and journalist Danielle Lazar, joins us from New York. We have writer and journalist John White, who joins us from Edinburgh. I'd like to welcome you both. And John White, the sanctions as described by the UN, based on what they have said sanctions that were imposed in the name of delivering human rights are in fact killing people and depriving them of fundamental rights, including the rights to health, to food, and to life itself. So that's the definition that these group of UN experts actually have defined sanctions to be. When you think of sanctions, what country comes to mind, the country that's imposing sanctions?
Well, they're emanating from the heart of the empire, from Washington. And never has the base cruelty, mendacity and barbarity of Washington been more stark than now. This rogue administration has weaponized essentially COVID-19. It has exploited it to tighten the screw on countries that it deems the enemy without. And it proves and confirms that the world is suffering less from a coronavirus crisis, 2020, and more from an America crisis. This is an empire that has entered its mad dog days. It is no longer able to comprehend a world that it is no longer able to control in the way it used to, and it is doing everything in its power to maintain its hegemony and its domination. But empires thrive and are sustained by the force of their idea, not the idea of their force, ultimately. And when they're forced to rely on force in order to maintain their dominance, then nothing but nothing can halt their decline. So in essence, this is a tactic of desperation on the part of a declining empire, but the suffering, the monumental suffering being experienced by people all over the global south as a consequence of these sanctions should not be understated or underestimated. And I pray for the day that people responsible for doling out these sanctions in the name of democracy will see justice not just in the afterlife, but in this life as well.
Well, some of the items that are sanctioned, Daniel Lazar, are water. This is the UN experts that have compiled this based on what they have said. Water, soap, and electricity that's needed by hospitals, fuel for delivering vital goods, and food. And these are all in short supply because of these sanctions. Now, you would think, prior to the COVID-19, the type of harm that people are experiencing based on these shortcomings, and now with COVID-19, what situations countries are dealing with. Since John White talked about the U.S., does the U.S. knowingly then have these sanctions in place when it could lead to, especially in the COVID-19 world, to deaths?
Yes, I mean, Mr. White put it very well. I mean, the U.S. government, the U.S. imperialism has entered its mad dog phase. Trump is half in rebellion against the empire, and the other half is more frenzied in carrying out imperial policy. His policies to Iran especially are barbaric. It amounts to little more than biological warfare. When Iran applied for a $5 billion emergency IMF loan to help fight the pandemic, the U.S. actually blocked that loan. And the result is the pandemic was all the worse, and the pandemic, of course, is now wreaking havoc in the United States, which accounts for 4% of the world's population, but 22% of the world's COVID-19 deaths. So America is suffering from its own policies. It's falling apart internally. It's in severe crisis. And the worse the crisis at home, the more the U.S. strikes out blindly against its enemies abroad. And Iran is in the forefront of that imperialist war offensive.
John White, some of the countries I should add that have been mentioned in this report are Cuba, Iran, as our guest there in New York said, Sudan, Syria, Venezuela, and Yemen. We could also put North Korea there. Now, there's what's called an automatic request to guarantee human rights and solidarity, as the UN says. In the course of the pandemic, licenses for delivery of humanitarian aid should be provided in the easiest way, which is automatically upon request. Now, the U.S. Has not done that when it comes to Iran, with the way that the COVID-19 has overtaken this country or affected the country. Even though the U.S. says that it has allowed humanitarian aid to come into Iran. First of all, why is it saying that when it's not happening? And secondly, why would it prevent an automatic request? Because it would lead to saving lives.
Because it doesn't care about Iranian lives, despite the rhetoric to the contrary. You have to understand this empire, like any empire, operates on the basis of racism. And this Washington apparatus has a racist attitude towards the countries that it designates to be inferior and to be out with the circle of human worth that is self-established. So it doesn't care about Iranian lives. It doesn't care about human life in general. It doesn't care about the lives of its own citizens. These are countries, the countries that have suffered most grievously from COVID-19, it's interesting to note, are countries in which their ruling elites operate on the basis that society exists to serve the interests of the economy rather than an economy existing to serve the interests of society. These are inhumane, barbaric animals, I would actually call them, They are privileged, white, very rich savages. And this savagery is something to behold. But as I say, it is an empire that's in decline. That's why it's operating on these ever-increasing desperate measures to shore up its fading domination and hegemony. And Donald Trump is a symptom of this decline. He is not any aberration. He is America with its mask removed. The vulgar capitalism, the rampant individualism, the white supremacy. He is America tout court. And we actually had an insight into the diseased mind of the American imperialists back in 1996, didn't we? When Madeleine Albright, then Secretary of State, was interviewed National Security Advisor, I think, was interviewed by Leslie Stahl for 60 Minutes and asked about the sanctions that were hurting the people of Iraq. 2 million killed, 500,000 children. And she brought that figure up and asked, is it worth it? 500,000 children dead in Iraq. And Madeleine Albright said, yes, it was worth it, thus ensuring her first-class passage to hell. This is the mind of these people. These people are barbarians, and we should never, ever underestimate what they are willing to do to try and shore up their interests, fueled as they are by greed and nothing more than power-hungry monsters. So to answer to your question, they don't care about Iranian lives. Iran's sin, Iran's crime is that it refuses to bend the knee to the Washington's writ. That's why Iran is in the crosshairs, and that's why Iran will remain in the crosshairs as long as Washington is able to extend its writ anywhere it so wishes. The Middle East is a very important strategic region of the world for Washington for various reasons, and Iran is a strong opposition to its ability to control the region without any opposition. Nothing more. There's nothing more complicated about this scenario than that.
Okay, just to make sure, Daniel Lazar, for anybody just tuning in, people might think that we're just, this is a program about America bashing. We're not trying to do that, and we're trying to separate the American people from the administration, so let's be clear on that. Our guest, John White, talked about that Madeleine Albright interview at 60 Minutes. Let's look back on something that was just a couple of years ago that, in a sense, also drives home the American mentality of this U.S. administration. And I'm talking about how the U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said back then that it is in Iran's best interest to toe the line and listen to Washington, or else its people will pay the price. He said Iran must listen to the U.S., and I'm going to quote him, if they want their people to eat. I don't know if you recall that. Your reaction, if you don't, to what Mike Pompeo said back then.
It's just perfectly in keeping. I mean, first of all, Pompeo issued a series of 12 demands of Iran, and the demands are essentially added up to a call for abject surrender, which no government could ever possibly agree to. So the U.S. just wants Iran to revert back to a colonial status, and it thinks nothing of pulverizing the country and harming its population in order to achieve that goal. And this is, in the case of the Middle East, this is really all about oil. The U.S. Essentially struck an alliance with Saudi Arabia in 1944. That is, the Saudis are America's oldest partner in the Middle East, even older than Israel. And essentially, in so doing, in recent decades, the U.S. has thrown its weight behind a Saudi-led Sunni Islam offensive against the Shia population throughout the Middle East. Iran has had no choice but to resist those policies. It can't help but do it, and it can't help but extend aid and solidarity to populations in Iraq, Yemen, Syria, and Lebanon, who are similarly threatened by U.S. policies. Now, this is not a question of America bashing. Americans, the average American, has little idea of what's being done in his name in the Middle East. The average American has little understanding of what's going on. And the average American, believe me, doesn't know the difference between Shia and Sunni Islam, or they're completely in the dark. So these policies are over the head of the American population, and they're really just about feeding the American economy. and the American war machine, and oil is its lifeblood. So essentially, we have 70 years of U.S. policy geared towards ensuring a steady flow of oil from the Persian Gulf, and that means chiefly from the Saudis, and opposing any nation that gets in its way, and that means Syria and its allies in the region.
Let's take a look at its batting average. I mean, according to research, John White, on the efficiency of these sanctions, according to one report, sanctions have about a 4% success rate in achieving their stated purpose. So the basic question here, why is the U.S. pursuing a policy that has such a low success rate?
Well, we have to understand what the primary objective of sanctions are. The primary objective of economic sanctions, and by the way, this is not a benign instrument of coercion. These sanctions are a form of war. They're a weapon of war. They are the unleashing of a low-intensity war against the countries that are suffering under those sanctions. But the primary objective of sanctions is to create internal unrest, is to try and achieve societal collapse, and to try and create, as I say, internal unrest in the countries that are labouring under these sanctions, with the rest of the population suffering the consequences. But the lack of success rate is not really not an issue in Washington, because they have no other option. There is no appetite in America amongst its population for hard power, for long, prolonged wars. The war in Iraq was a disaster. That was a defeat for America. That was meant to be a cakewalk, and that actually pushed along a rapid pace the trajectory towards imperial decline. Obama came in; he had to get out of Iraq because the country was suffering economic consequences of Iraq. It was meant to be a boon for American corporations, taking up new security and construction contracts, as well as controlling Iraq's oil. It's proved anything but, and actually that solidified Iran's influence in the region rather than diminished it. So you have to understand the colonial mind is not a pragmatic or a rational mind. These people are driven by an ideology of power, by any means necessary, of might is right, and so reason does not come into it. These people are fueled by unreason, and you're actually right. Sanctions do not work. They've failed to topple one government that they have been introduced against, whether it's Venezuela, whether it's Cuba, where sanctions have been levelled against Cuba since the early 1960s. And in many cases, it actually increases the resolve of the people who are suffering under these sanctions and raises the level of public consciousness as to the role of America in the world, the malign role of America in the world. But Daniel made a very interesting point, which I think is very important. The average American has no knowledge of what's going on in world affairs. It's one of the most insular societies of any. I lived there for 7 years. It's a news information desert. The focus of the news is on the what of events rather than on the why of events. There is very little in the way of any analysis that runs deeper than this happened, this happened, this happened, and we're the good guys and they're the bad guys. And that's a big problem for the world. But that's actually starting to change now with the rise of Black Lives Matter and the rise of resistance to Donald Trump and resistance to the Washington's attempt to try and make everything rosy in the garden of America. I am absolutely convinced that this empire will fall from within, and I think it's only a matter of time before it does.
Well, we got about, a couple minutes left here, Daniel Lazar. I'm not too sure which country to go after, but we need to talk about maybe two countries, Yemen and Venezuela, if we can fit this in. So I'm going to ask you about Yemen. I don't know what to tell you about Yemen that you don't know. Perhaps American people are not aware of it, but I'm sure you are, Daniel Lazar, and many people around the world are really questioning why the U.S. is continuing backing this Saudi-led coalition in this war, because the images speak for themselves, the stats speak for themselves, and these are helpless people. I mean, you have the Ansarullah movement that is trying to hold up to the onslaught by the Saudi-led coalition, which is, again, provided ammunition, planes, what have you, by the U.S. What are your thoughts on how the U.S. why is the U.S. continuing to support this war, which they're not winning after, about 5 years, I think?
It's a very good question. I mean, first of all, bear in mind that as John said, Americans are completely uninformed about the Middle East. 99 out of 100 Americans could not find Yemen on the map. They have no idea what it is. And The war there is a war by the richest country in the Middle East against the poorest country in the Middle East. Obama backed the war in 2015 because he wanted to assuage Saudi feelings. The Saudis felt hurt and left out because of the JCPOA, the nuclear accord the U.S. was negotiating with Iran at the time. So the U.S. felt it had no choice but to smooth Saudi Arabia's ruffled feathers by agreeing to a war on Yemen. It's astonishing. The destruction has been amazing. One of the poorest countries has been leveled. It's a humanitarian disaster, and the U.S. can't stop because Saudi Arabia is still its closest ally in the Middle East, and the Trump administration values it as a extremely lucrative market for U.S. Weapons manufacturers. So the U.S. is now for economic reasons wants to see that war go on, and children, civilians. The price is fantastic, and America doesn't care. It just doesn't care.
Okay. John White, to you, Venezuela. One point last year there was a report that indicated there was some. Let me make sure I get this right. It was about 40,000 people that, based on the Center for Economic and Policy Research, may have died as a result of the U.S. sanctions. You would think that at this point Maduro is still standing, that the U.S. again would give up because its success rate is not yielding the results it wants. Why do you think the U.S. is still after Venezuela in that form and manner that it is, with the humanitarian toll that could be now much higher? This report was a year old.
Because Washington is determined to return Venezuela to, in its mind, its rightful place as a wholly owned subsidiary of the United States. Venezuela has huge oil resources, and the U.S. wants those resources in its keeping. That's why Washington has embarked on this crazed attempt to topple the democratically elected government of Nicolas Maduro, and it's a tribute to the consciousness of the Venezuelan people, and especially the generals in the army, that they refuse to budge from support for Nicolas Maduro. They understand that the suffering that they are experiencing right now has got nothing to do with Nicolas Maduro, everything to do with Washington and its economic war that's been waging against the country.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we're going to end it there. We didn't have a chance to talk about Syria and Cuba. However, thank you, author and journalist Daniel Lazar from New York, writer and journalist John White from Edinburgh. Thank you for tuning in to another edition of Debate. From me, the entire team is goodbye. Until next time.